بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, in today's class, we will pick up in the discussion of the number of divorces. We ended in the last class by talking about a pronouncement of divorce prior to marriage does not take effect. We'll just kind of backtrack a little bit, review that. And then we will talk about the four types of divorces, or the four kind of husbands rather, in which the divorce does not take effect. The immature, the insane, the person who is asleep, and the person who is coerced to do so. And of course, in all of these, there will be some details. We will make notable mention to the issue of the person who's intoxicated, even though this came previously. I think we discussed that in the last module, but in this one we'll just kind of repeat. And then we will enter into the following. The following that is the section on taking back one's wife. And this is the raj'a, when a man divorces his wife, of course the wife has a waiting period, an iddah, and during that waiting period, as long as it's not a final divorce, the man can return his wife. So this section talks about that fiqh, how does that happen? And what happens if he outstays the waiting period? In that case, he has to have a new contract. If it's during the waiting period, during the 3 cycles, then the 3 menstrual cycles, then how can he take her back? And then if the waiting period expires, he can marry with a new contract. She will return with whatever number of divorces remain. So in that basically we learn that the man divorces his wife, like say it's a first divorce. She has the waiting period. In the middle of the waiting period, he takes her back. She still has one divorce like in her logbook. So he can divorce her a second time and then do that. And then a third time, it's a final thing. So we're going to talk about the fiqh of that. Of course, in a man taking back his wife, there are exceptions. There are some men that can't do that, and then there are some men that can do that. And then we want to learn what the fiqh of that is. So pretty much a straightforward conversation, picking up where we left off, but we won't unfortunately be able to continue that section due to the length of it, and then we will pick that up in the following. Sorry I've prolonged this, but just to wrap it up. So aside, the madhab of Abi Hanifa aside, radiallahu anhu, the majority opinion of the fuqaha and the fiqh al-mawruth, the inherited fiqh, as is codified in our madhab, is that a legal guardian is required to marry off a young person. So if the young person, how is he translated in the book? The immature. Okay, maybe that's fine, but I would probably translate it as a young person. But anyway, if the legal guardian is required to marry that young person, likewise the divorce is married. So what that means is, let's say that there's 2 people that are married that are like 9 years old. Again, pre-modern time, think about that. And they get into a fight over something, and they're immature, they're young, and then the boy says to the girl, "You're divorced." That divorce does not count because he does not possess within himself inherently the power to marry or to divorce. Okay, and then the insane person. When we talk about insanity in the Sharia, we always distinguish insanity / sickness. We always distinguish between temporary and permanent. So in both cases, while the person is insane and incapacitated, I was trying to think of the Latin term and I couldn't capture it, and it messed up with the English, is incapacitated, at that moment, whether it's temporary or permanent, that does not count. However, if a man is within reason and then says a divorce pronouncement and then becomes insane / sick temporarily, that pronouncement still counts. So when he says that the divorce of the insane person, the divorce pronouncement of the insane person doesn't count, it means at the time of insanity. Now, again, you can see from what we're saying that this requires a legislative body to be able to regulate that, whether it be the office of the mufti or the qadi or a local magistrate, but somebody has to be able to determine if this person is insane or just fooling around. Related to the insane, he talks about the issue of intoxication. In our madhab, as we said, if somebody becomes intoxicated on purpose, They are outside of their mind, but because of the enormity of intoxication and the crime, the moral crime of that, we allow that pronouncement to count. So the divorce pronouncement count, just like the marriage pronouncement of the drunk person counts as well. That's the mu'tamad, and it comes from Imam Shafi'i himself, radiallahu anhu, in the However, if somebody is intoxicated by accident, so I'm walking in the streets, and in traditional Islamic cultures, there would be these clay vessels in which you could drink water. I grabbed one to drink it, not knowing that there's alcohol in it, and I became intoxicated. So, I passed by an apothecary, sorry, a pharmacy, I think that's the right word, and there were medicines outside mixed with the water, and I accidentally took one and I became intoxicated. That type of person is intoxicated by accident, so they're excused. So we make that distinction. And then he says, rahimahullah, the person who's asleep. Okay? So there's no taklif when you're sleeping, as we mentioned when we talked about and we introduced the concept of moral responsibility. Taklif. So if a person was asleep and was sleepwalking, and this happens, and says something in their sleep, also that does not count. They are excused. And then the person who is coerced and mukrah, and this is an important, very long discussion, not only in the books of furu'a, but you'll find the discussions in usul al-fiqh, coercion. And coercion is then defined. So if somebody says, if you don't divorce your wife today, I'm going to kill you next month. And he divorces his wife, that divorce pronouncement counts because there is time for him to wiggle out, basically. I mean, the Shia doesn't say wiggle out, but there's a what is the word that he used? Okay, I can't find it right now. But he's able to, he says, biharab minhu. He can protect himself against the one who coerces him through escaping him. So that's a way of escaping. Okay, yeah, sure. And then the day passes and you go to the police and they arrest him or something like that. But if the person holds a gun to your head and said, if you don't say to your wife you're divorced now, I'm going to kill you, that's the person that's coerced. Whatever that person says doesn't count. So that pronouncement is not going to bear any weight in the Sharia because the person is coerced, just like the hadith that we read of the Prophet ﷺ that Allah Ta'ala has lifted from the community of Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, the person who was coerced. And coercion happens. Now, the gun to the head, I'll kill you unless you do it now, is like literally the textbook, well, not the gun, but I'm going to kill you right now unless you do it, is the textbook understanding of coercion. You have to understand that there are many other ways in the modern world in which people are coerced. Sometimes there is coercion through fear, sometimes there's coercion through intimidation, sometimes there's coercion from the state, unfortunately, and sometimes there's coercion from businesses, sometimes there's coercion from litigation. So all of those have to be, and now in the practical fiqh, all of those things have to be considered. Is that the type of coercion that the threat of someone's going to steal your home or kill your children or kidnap your kids? Some countries there's a lot of kidnapping, etc. Well, that's a type of coercion. So if you did something or said something because of that coercion and that great fear, it's not going to count unless there was a way for you to escape from it. And in the Hashiyah, he does give examples of coercion by scaring someone through beating them, extent beating them, by incarcerating, al-habs, itlaf al-mal, ruining them financially, taking away their money, and things, وَنَحْوَ ذَلِكَ, and things like that. Then he says, وَإِذَا ظَهَرَ فِي الْمُكْرَهِ بِفَتْحِ الرَّأِي, the one who is coercing. So if the one who is coercing, if it's manifest through him, قَرِينَةُ الْإِخْتِيَارِ وَقَعَ الطَّلَاقِ. So if the one who was coercing coerces in a way in which there's an option, and the example, I didn't read this, but the example he gives, if the one coercing says, divorce your wife 3 times, and then you said, I divorced my wife twice, and you're not penalized by the one coercing you, then that means that there was a way out. So then that pronouncement would count. So anyway, the coercion that makes the divorce pronouncement not count is the coercion, as he says, there are many different scenarios of coercion, is a way in which there's no way out of it. There's no wiggle room out of it. Okay? So that's very important, and that coercion will come again up in crimes and punishments. And he repeats the thing about the drunk person. Okay, so we can move on from here. Taking back one's wife. Okay, so taking back one's wife, again, just to review, the scenario is that a man has issued a divorce pronouncement to his wife, and it is the first or second divorce pronouncement, and she is in her waiting period, her iddah, which is 3 menstrual, ثلاثة قروء, as the Quran says, 3 menstrual cycles, and in that time, he softens, towards her or whatever, and he wants to take her back. Of course, when he wants to take her back, he has to say that. You can't just, in our madhab, a man can't just have intercourse with his wife during that time, and that act of intercourse is a way of taking back, even though some of the madhab allow that. But for us, there has to be a sigha, there has to be a verbiage, and that will come up shortly. And then again, that comes from the verse in Al-Baqarah 228, وَبُعُولَتِهُنَّ أَحَقُّ بِرَدِّهِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ إِنْ أَرَادُوا إِصْلَاحًا. Now, when it comes to the verbiage, when it comes to the man taking back his wife, the man can't be the type of man who is not able to marry himself. So if somebody is like young, or somebody is his assets are frozen, and the court has assigned a trustee over him to be able to enact it, because marriage, there's a financial component to that, and he can't marry himself, then he can also bring back his wife during this period. So one of the conditions, it's like a subtle condition, because when we're learning the fiqh for the first time around, we're not thinking about all these scenarios, but I might as well tell it to you since I already started the conversation. So the man has to be one of the people that is able to enact a marriage contract to begin with. If the person requires the permission of like their wali, for example, like the young boy, as we said, then the pronouncement of taking back doesn't count. We'll pick it up in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay, so we talked about some of the conditions of the taking back of the husband. We were just in the last clip saying it has to be a man who is able to take back his wife without the permission of somebody. There has to be a sigha, there has to be verbiage, like I take you back, I want you back, you come back to me, whatever. And there can be kinaya, there can be sort of, it doesn't have to be direct, it can be implied through a nice gesture or something like that. That also counts. Okay. Now, of course, another condition is worth saying is that the woman has to be a woman whose divorce is not final. Okay, because if the woman has been divorced 3 times, that's the next part of the section we're not going to get to in this clip. Then he can't take her back, except if she remarries, and we'll talk about that tomorrow or in the next clip. So she has to be 2 or 1 divorces only. Okay, so he says, if the husband has divorced his wife once or twice, I apologize, the husband has divorced his wife once or twice, meaning it's not final, he may take her back as long as her waiting period has not expired. If the waiting period is expired, then there's going to be a new contract, but still they are with the same amount of divorces if they remarry. So here we're talking about, because in a textbook divorce, a man divorces his wife and they are in the same home for the three cycles, for the iddah period. Allah says in the Quran, maybe something will happen. So the point of the waiting period and the point of them being in the same domicile is that something might happen, meaning they might be able to get back together again. So in that case, you don't have to go and do a whole new aqd and mahar and sigha and all that kind of stuff. You just take her back, as long as you tell her that. If it's outside of the waiting period, then you can take her back, of course, but you have to enact a new marriage contract. If the waiting period expires, well, okay, that's going to be the next one. Let's see what else I want to say. When we said that one of the conditions is that the man taking back his wife has to be able to, his pronouncement is owned by him and has effect, this also includes the drunk person. So, like we allow the we don't excuse the drunk person for something that they do if they are drunk on purpose, is the principle in our madhab. So if a drunk person that's drunk on purpose divorces his wife, the divorce counts, but also likewise, if he takes back his wife, then the taking back of his wife counts. So there is a consistency in that issue. But somebody who's like a murtad, for example, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, somebody who has left Islam, their taking back of the wife is not accepted, because the only thing that's accepted from them is their Islam again. And then, kind of paying back the things that they owe, including that. But the more textbook example, just for you to remember it, is going to be the divorce of a young person. So a young person divorces his wife through the wali, okay, not by themselves, because we just said in the previous section it doesn't count. And then the same young person wants to bring back his wife, can't bring back his wife on his own volition, he has to do that through the wali. And likewise, the insane person, the same type of rules would follow for that. Anybody who requires permission, that's not going to anybody who requires permission for the marriage and or divorce to take place, the taking back of the person, the taking back during the waiting period will not count from their own. They have to seek assistance. Okay, let me just go back a second because I feel like I missed a few things I wanted to say. My bookmarks keep falling. Okay, well, actually, that's all I wanted to say. So, since we have some time, let me just read the next section, since we have the time to do that. So, he says, Rahimahullah, if the waiting period expires, he can marry her with a new contract. She will return with whatever number of divorces remain. So, a man divorces his wife, and it's the first divorce, and the waiting period passes, the iddah passes, she moves out, she goes back to her family, or she gets a place on her own, or whatever, and then a year passes and he wants to marry her, given that she hasn't remarried, he wants to marry her. He can marry her again, of course, but there has to be a new contract, so you kind of have to do the whole thing again. You have all of the things we talked about in the nikah. There has to be a wali, there has to be the mahar, there has to be the sigha, ijab and qubul, all of that kind of stuff. He does that again, and then they're married, but they're married with that one divorce in the ledger. So whatever number of divorces they had, one or two, and they remarry, they're going to remarry with that if the taking back did not take place during the iddah, and it's outside of the iddah, the waiting period, in which case it requires a new marriage contract. Okay, and then he says, if he divorces her 3 times, she remains unlawful for him until 5 conditions are met. Her waiting period from him expires, another man marries her, the new marriage is consummated, she is divorced from the new husband, and her waiting period from the new husband expires. So, in the case of a man divorcing his wife 3 times, whether it's 3 separate times or whether it is 3 times in one pronouncement, then it's a ba'in, it's a final divorce. So they cannot remarry unless this following scenario takes place. Which is the first thing is that she has to wait for her iddah to finish from her husband who just divorced her 3 times. And then after that she has to have a new marriage, whether immediately or after some time, from a new man. That new marriage has to be consummated. Then she has to divorce that new husband, and then she has to wait her waiting period. Why does she have to wait her waiting period? Because during the waiting period, that new husband can take her back, as that's what this lecture is about. After that, they can remarry and they can reset at 0 again. In some cultures, there's this idea of a muhallil, or somebody who will just do like a marriage on paper in that scenario, and then do a marriage and divorce so that the wife can go back to the husband. Obviously, it goes without saying that that's haram, because as you just saw, other than the waiting periods, the key is that that new marriage has to be consummated. And the reason is that the Prophet ﷺ said, so that the wife, in this, who has just been divorced 3 times and is remarried, she has to taste this new life, this new marital life with this man. And that's not fully done except when the sexual act also takes place, in addition to living together and going through the marriage contract and all of that kind of stuff. Because maybe khalas, she'll just emotionally move on, and then that will be her thing, and she'll be under the care of a new man, and maybe that man won't want to divorce her and want to keep her and things like that. So there's a hikmah in it. So this idea that we're just going to do like a paper marriage and divorce in like one sitting so that you can go back to your previous husband, that's obviously super haram, and actually considered a type of fornication. And may Allah Ta'ala protect us, it's a major sin. Anyway, I rushed through that last part just because we had extra time. We'll review that in the next class, inshallah, in full, so we didn't lose any pieces. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. We actually did a lot more in today's class than I thought we were going to do. Sometimes the hashia, when I prepare, he gets so into the weeds and I'm like reading. And then when I come to talk to him, like, I don't need to convey all of the details to you. And today was one of those days where I was able to do a lot more than I had originally anticipated. So we wrapped up the number of divorces section by talking about that there are 4 types of initiated divorces that don't count, which is from a man who is immature, insane, asleep, or coerced to do so. We went through those and I gave you some examples, hopefully, that you can keep in mind. We also mentioned not included in this is the drunkard person, the person who's intoxicated on purpose. That counts, both in divorce and in marriage, for the reasons that we mentioned. And then we actually did the whole section of taking back one's wife, but I kind of rushed through the last part, and I promised that in the next lecture we'll do it again. It's a little slow, but we said that a man who's divorced his wife while his wife is in the waiting period, the iddah, he can take her back through a direct pronouncement, given that he is able to make a marriage pronouncement in the first place, not like he's a young person and requires the permission of his wali. And then if the waiting period expires, he can remarry her, but he has to remarry her through a new contract. However, if a man divorces his wife 3 times, then it is a final irrevocable divorce, al-ba'in, and in which case she can remarry the man, but she has to do that by waiting her waiting period, having a new marriage, consummating the new marriage, divorcing in the new marriage, and waiting the entire waiting period of the new marriage, in which case she can go back to her previous husband and start anew with 0 divorces and see how that goes. And we talked a little bit about the hikmah of the marriage being consummated. In some cultures, there's this concept of a muhallil, or somebody who allows, is like a transitory marriage, like on paper marriage and divorce, and obviously that's haram, it goes without saying. But like I said, there is going to be some details that I left out in that quick overview. So in tomorrow's class, inshallah, we'll go over that in a little bit more detail so that we have a full understanding of what we're talking about. So those are the main topics that we talked about in today's lecture. I hope that made sense, and we'll see you back for a continued discussion. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim tasliman kathira. Okay, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. We actually did a lot more in today's class than I thought we were going to do. Sometimes the Hashia, when I prepare, he gets so into the weeds, and I'm like reading. And then when I come to talk to him, like, I don't need to convey all of the details to you. And today was one of those days where I was able to do a lot more than I had originally anticipated. So we wrapped up the number of divorces section by talking about that there are 4 types of initiated divorces that don't count, which is from a man who is immature, insane, asleep, or coerced to do so. We went through those and I gave you some examples, hopefully, that you can keep in mind. We also mentioned not included in this is the drunkard person, the person who's intoxicated on purpose. That counts, both in divorce and in marriage, for the reasons that we mentioned. And then we actually did the whole section of taking back one's wife, but I kind of rushed through the last part, and I promised that in the next lecture we'll do it again. It's a little slow, but we said that a man who's divorced his wife while his wife is in the waiting period, the iddah, he can take her back through a direct pronouncement, given that he is able to make a marriage pronouncement in the first place, not like he's a young person and requires the permission of his wali. And then if the waiting period expires, he can remarry her, but he has to remarry her through a new contract. However, if a man divorces his wife 3 times, then it is a final irrevocable divorce, al-ba'in, and in which case she can remarry the man, but she has to do that by waiting her waiting period, having a new marriage, consummating the new marriage, divorcing in the new marriage, and waiting the entire waiting period of the new marriage, in which case she can go back to her previous husband and start anew with 0 divorces and see how that goes. And we talked a little bit about the hikmah of the marriage being consummated. In some cultures, there's this concept of a muhallil, or somebody who allows, is like a transitory marriage, like on paper marriage and divorce, and obviously that's haram, it goes without saying. But like I said, there is going to be some details that I left out in that quick overview. So in tomorrow's class, inshallah, we'll go over that in a little bit more detail so that we have a full understanding of what we're talking about. So those are the main topics that we talked about in today's lecture. I hope that made sense, and we'll see you back for a continued discussion. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim tasliman kathira.